She said the cabin was hers, that the HOA gave her permission to redecorate my silence. She brought scented candles, brunch menus, and a clipboard. So I brought welding gloves and sealed the door shut, not out of anger, but out of reverence. Because some sanctuaries aren't meant to be shared, and some Karens are meant to be welded out. The lake doesn't speak in words. It murmurs in mist, in ripples, in the hush between bird calls. I built my cabin here not to escape the world, but to remember it differently. The HOA never reached this far, or so I thought. But Karen, vice chair of the Suburban Harmony Association, believed silence was a loophole. And my cabin? A community asset. She arrived with scented candles and bylaws. She left with brunch menus and a clipboard. And I began to weld. The lake doesn't ask for attention. It simply exists, quiet, ancient, and whole. I built my cabin here not to escape the world, but to remember it differently. A place where silence had shape, where time moved like fog across water. But silence, like property lines, is something Karen never respected. She arrived with scented candles and bylaws. She left with brunch menus and a clipboard. And I watched from the dock, coffee cooling in my hand. She said it was underutilized, that the HOA bylaws allowed temporary communal access. She parked her SUV in my boat shed. She hung curtains. She hosted brunch. She turned my sanctuary into a showroom, my solitude into a schedule, and the lake watched in silence. Text. Incident #0472, a unauthorized entry, lakeside cabin complainant. Me perpetrator. Karen, HOA vice chair, self-appointed. The cabin is technically within HOA jurisdiction. It's been vacant for 17 consecutive weekends. I propose we designate it as a shared amenity. HOA member murmuring, if it's not being used, it's being wasted. Karen, I'm not claiming ownership.
I'm claiming stewardship.
Stewardship, a word she wielded like a crowbar. Not to protect, but to pry. She claimed it was for ambience. I called it trespassing. The HOA called it creative stewardship. They toasted to community, to shared spaces, to the illusion of belonging. I watched from the dock, my cabin now a stage, my silence now a prop. I didn't speak, not yet. I let the lake speak for me, in ripples, in wind, in the quiet refusal of water to be owned. Karen didn't hear it. She heard bylaws. She heard brunch. That was the moment silence became resistance, the moment I chose steel. I didn't choose violence.
I chose boundary. I chose style.
She spoke of bylaws, of community, of shared dreams. But the lake had other plans, and so did I. I didn't choose confrontation.
I chose préservation.
The cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was memory, and memory deserves armor. Each line was a boundary, each measurement a refusal. I wasn't building a wall. I was restoring silence. I bought rods, gloves, a mask, not for destruction, for devotion. The first weld was for silence, the second for sovereignty, the third for every moment Karen turned my sanctuary into a showroom. Every seal was a stanza, every spark a syllable. I wasn't closing a door. I was writing a poem. She called the HOA. She called the sheriff. She called her cousin who does real estate law. But the cabin stayed silent, just like the lake. They spoke in codes. I spoke in sparks. She rallied the cul-de-sac, but the lake didn't sign. The last weld was for peace, for the right to remember without interruption, for the lake and everything it never said. She mistook silence for surrender, but silence was the loudest thing I had. I didn't leave to escape. I left to listen. 10 days.
No phones. No hoa.
Just trees, breath, and the sound of Karen yelling at a welded door. She documented my departure like a crime scene. Her clipboard trembled with urgency. But silence isn't suspicious. It's sacred. The retreat was tucked deep in the forest.
No Wi-Fi. No bailos.
Just a bell rung at sunrise, and the hush of pine needles underfoot. I unpacked slowly. A journal, a thermos, a pair of boots that had walked through HOA hearings and neighborhood petitions. Now, they walked toward stillness. The cabin was smaller than mine.
No mantle. No scented candles.
Just a window that framed the stream like a painting. I sat by the water. A leaf drifted past. A heron landed without ceremony. Time didn't pass here. It pooled. Back home, Karen was escalating. She called the board. She called the sheriff. She called her cousin who does real estate law. But the cabin stayed sealed. And I stayed silent. She hired a locksmith. He tried the door. Shrugged. Left. She posted flyers. Community Cabin Recovery Initiative. Only 2 people showed up. One left early. The other asked if there'd be snacks. I didn't know any of this. I was watching a spider rebuild its web after rain. I was sketching welds in my journal, not to plan, but to remember. I wrote about the lake, about the absurdity of HOA cupcakes, about the way Karen mistook proximity for possession. I didn't write to publish. I wrote to preserve. Each morning, I walked barefoot through the woods. The ground was soft, the silence softer. Karen chased control. I chased stillness. And stillness never runs. She filed a lawsuit. The document was stamped, dismissed. The judge asked if she had a key. She said no. He said, then it's not yours. She tried to rally the cul-de-sac, but the trees didn't attend. I meditated by a waterfall. The sound was louder than her voice, and kinder. I remembered the first time I saw the lake, before the HOA, before the bylaws, before the brunch. It shimmered like a secret, and I promised never to speak over it. 10 days passed. No phones. No HOA. Just breath. Just boundaries. I didn't return to reclaim. I returned to remember. The cabin waited, sealed, serene, sovereign. Karen had moved on, to a new complaint, to a new clipboard, but the welds remained, and so did the silence. I returned not to reclaim, but to witness what stillness had built in my absence. The forest greeted me like an old friend, unchanged, unbothered, unlisted in any HOA directory. The cabin stood exactly as I left it, welded, weathered, waiting. Karen had moved on. Her clipboard now chased a neighbor's wind chimes. She claimed they violated the auditory tranquility clause. The HOA nodded. The wind did not. I stepped onto the porch. The welds shimmered in the morning light, not as barriers, but as brushstrokes in a painting of defiance. Inside, the air was still. Dust had settled like memory. The lake outside whispered in ripples, as if asking, "Did you find what you were looking for?" I did. I found the space between noise and necessity, the breath between battles, the quiet that Karen could never colonize. I lit a fire, not for warmth, but for ritual. The flames danced like old stories, flickering, fragile, but unforgotten. I unpacked my journal. Its pages were full now. Sketches of welds, poems about moss, reflections on silence. I wrote one last entry. The cabin is no longer a place. It is a posture, a refusal to be rushed, a monument to boundaries. Karen tried one final tactic. She filed a motion to have the cabin declared abandoned. The judge asked, "Is it welded shut?" She said yes. He said, "Then someone cared enough to seal it." She stormed out. Her clipboard snapped in two. The HOA newsletter mourned the loss of its most active contributor. I stayed for 3 more days.
No phones. No HOA.
Just the lake and the sound of welds holding. I watched the moon rise over the water. It cast a silver line across the surface, like a boundary drawn by nature itself. I didn't sleep much, not because I was restless, but because I didn't want to miss anything. The cabin had become a cathedral, not of religion, but of reverence. I left quietly.
No announcement. No farewell brunch.
Just a note taped to the inside wall. This cabin is not abandoned. It is claimed by silence. Karen never returned. The HOA moved on. The lake remained. And somewhere, deep in the woods, a welded door still holds. Not against intrusion, but against forgetting. This was never about property. It was about poetry, about the right to retreat, about the audacity of stillness. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I welded. Years passed. The lake remained. The welds held, not just the metal but the memory. Karen moved 3 cul-de-sacs away. Her clipboard retired. Her HOA newsletter folded. The final issue featured a recipe for lemon bars and a blurry photo of the cabin, captioned, "Unresolved." But the cabin was never unresolved. It was resolved in silence, in sovereignty, in the refusal to be explained. Neighbors whispered about it. Children dared each other to touch the welded door. One did. He said it hummed. The lake became legend, not for its depth, but for its defiance. I returned once a year, always alone, always in autumn, when the leaves turned the color of rusted steel. I brought no phone,
No clipboard.
just a thermos, and a journal now bound in leather. Inside, the cabin was unchanged. The dust had settled into ritual. The silence had grown roots. I lit the fire, not to warm the room but to honor the welds, each flame a memory, each ember a boundary. I wrote new entries, not about Karen. She had become footnote. I wrote about the lake, about the way silence ages, about the myth of ownership. One year, I found a note tucked under a stone by the door. It read, "I understand now. Thank you."
No signature.
Just understanding. The cabin became a pilgrimage, for those tired of noise, for those who needed to remember what stillness feels like. I never unlocked the door, not once, because some sanctuaries are meant to remain sealed. Karen was interviewed once, a local podcast on neighborhood disputes. She said, "I don't regret anything, but I do wonder what he found in there." The host asked, "Did you ever ask him?" She said, "He never answered," and that was the answer. The cabin outlived the HOA. The bylaws dissolved, the newsletter archived, but the welds remained. I aged. My boots were thin. My journal grew heavy, but the cabin stayed light. One autumn, I left my final entry. "This cabin is not mine. It is yours, if you understand silence." I sealed the journal in a tin box, buried it beneath the porch. A time capsule of quiet. Karen passed away. Her obituary listed her hobbies: organizing, clipboarding, lemon bars. The cabin was not mentioned, but the lake remembered, and so did I. Now, when the wind moves through the trees, it sounds like welds cooling, like boundaries breathing, like silence saying, "You were right to hold." The cabin is still there, welded, weathered, waiting, not for visitors, but for reverence. And somewhere, in the hush between seasons, Karen is quiet, and the cabin is legend. Long after the clipboard wars faded, long after the bylaws were boxed and buried, the cabin remained, not as a structure, not as a possession, but as a prayer, welded shut, whispered open. The lake grew quieter each year, not from absence, but from reverence. Visitors came and went. Some left stones, some left poems. No one left noise. The welds rusted gently, not from neglect, but from time doing what time does best, softening the sharp edges. Karen became a story, told in hushed tones at bonfires, a cautionary tale about control and the futility of clipboards in the face of silence. The cabin was never unlocked, not once, because some doors are meant to remain closed so that something deeper can open. I aged. My steps slowed. My journal grew heavier with meaning, but the cabin stayed light, buoyed by the quiet it protected. One autumn I didn't return. The lake noticed. The heron circled once, then flew on. But the cabin didn't mourn. It remembered, and in remembering, it became something more. A welded prayer, a myth with moss on its roof, a sanctuary for those who understand that silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of soul. And so it waits, not for me, not for Karen, but for anyone brave enough to leave the door closed.